Paul threw me a Yellow Pages. He trained me by throwing me a Yellow Pages and telling me to call Sand Company. So we obviously had no technology then. And we started working together, and I was able to make some headway as a salesperson. Of course, both of us were doing everything, right? And we started building the business.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Freight Caviar podcast. Before we begin, I wanted to give a special shout out to our sponsor, TAB LLC. They offer incredible support and opportunities for freight agents. Freight agents, wouldn't it be life-changing to have a higher commission split and a support team focused on helping you build your dream? At TAB, we pay our agents up to 80% of gross profit without compromising on technology or support. Make more money and guarantee a better experience for your customers and carriers by joining the team at TAB. It all starts with a short, enjoyable phone call with our leadership team to see the TAB difference. To learn more and schedule a quick call, go to tab-llc.com and change your future. Welcome back to another episode of the Freight Caviar podcast. Today we are joined by Noam Frankel. Noam was one of the founding members of American Backhaulers. He served as a COO from 1983 to 1992, and then went on to run truckload at Echo, built up basically the whole truckload division at Echo. Then went on to start Optimal Freight, and then recently, Freight Friend was acquired by Truckstop. So we'll take it all the way from the beginning, and then work our way to now.
Also, a pretty big history between American Backhaulers and Echo. That was like a first entrepreneurial venture of yours.
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, I see American Backhaulers as an entrepreneurial venture.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was totally a startup when I joined.
Gotcha.
I was the first employee.
Sure.
And we kind of built it. Paul and I built it together for those first 10 years. But then I started a couple other businesses before I went back into the logistics industry outside of freight.
Okay. So, Noam, can you take us back to, the early 1980s? The industry was just deregulated.
Yeah.
And I know there's a lot of people didn't know this industry existed, or it was something that needed to be created. And Paul was working. I know I forgot what he was shipping back then, but can you kind of take us back then to the early 1980s? What was it like at American Backhaulers? Were you just kind of discovering this new industry and kind of working at it? How was that like?
Well, I graduated college in 1982 maybe. I think I graduated a semester early, and I came out looking for a job in transportation, primarily city transportation, regional transportation, RTA, CTA, and there were no jobs then, so I expanded my search. And actually a consultant from a family of the Stone Container family connected me with Paul. Paul had started a brokerage probably around 1982. He named it American Backhaulers. He identified the opportunity in this new field, freight brokerage. In the early 1980s, when we started, there were probably 500 brokers in the country. And that's because the industry was first deregulated in 1980 by Jimmy Carter. At that point, before then, authority was listed from one state to another state. So you have to get authority to haul goods from one state to another state.
In every state, you had to have authority.
In every state, you had to have authority. So these carriers had authority, which once deregulation happened, suddenly they had to write off a huge amount of value off their books, because now it was easy to get 48 state contract authority. And so what that also opened up is the ability for private fleets, people who are moving goods, freight for their own companies, to now start hauling other people's goods. So Paul really started American Backhaulers to utilize private fleets on backhauling freight. Paul was working part-time. Paul was working for his father, who was a sand broker, mainly brokering Martin Marietta sand. And then he started out by moving that sand loads on Sealy Posturepedic trucks from Florida back to Chicago, I think.
What exactly is that?
Sealy Posturepedic is still a bed manufacturer. mattress manufacturer.
Got it.
So he started off moving sand loads on Sealy Posturepedic trucks to fill their backhaul.
I thought it was a specific type of truck for whatever reason.
Yeah, no, it's regular van loads.
Got it.
And there was an attorney at the time by the name of Ed Bazelon. If you know Gary Bazelon, founder of Truck Freight.
That's my first job, truck.
Okay, so Gary's dad, Ed, was one of the first attorneys who did the early DFC case that really kind of allowed private fleets to get authority to haul other people's goods.
Okay.
And so he was then helping private fleets get this 48 state authority. It was still a nation, process. Mm-hmm. And he worked directly, would then refer them to Paul to get freight. So I was hired by a consultant who was working with Ed Bazelon, who was helping these private fleets legally get authority and then find freight to fill their backhauls. And then I was brought over to work with Paul in conjunction to do that. That's kind of how it started. Paul had been doing American Backhaulers, which he had the brilliance to name it American Backhaulers, to get into this industry and identify the opportunity and to get the phone number 1-800-Haulers. Right? So
that was the early days .com essentially, right? The 1-800-Haulers. If you got a good phone number to call, is easily accessible.
Yeah, I don't know if it was .com, but
no. I was trying to make the metaphor like the
yeah. Correct. That 800 number, if it was easily, absolutely, it was so easy to remember, and it made a huge difference for us. And so he was doing the brokerage on the side while selling sand for his dad. Maybe he was moving 10 loads a day at the time that I joined. And so when I went in, he went full time. We went full time into the business. Paul threw me a Yellow Pages. He trained me by throwing me a Yellow Pages and telling me to call Sand Company. So we obviously had no technology then. And we started working together, and I was able to make some headway as a salesperson. Of course, both of us were doing everything, right? And we started building the business. Early on, I recognized the opportunity that technology could bring to us, right? Technology was relatively new, but clearly what we were doing was, as we started to get to know loads and we started to get to know carriers, it was clear it was a big matching game that technology could make a big difference on. So I started to look for opportunities to bring technology into the business and started working on that. And then soon thereafter, recognized the value that I could bring to the business. And Paul and I negotiated that I would purchase 25% of the business from him back in 1983 or 84. And then one of my best friends at the time was a guy by the name of Jeff Silber. We had been camp counselors together. He was a year younger than me. So the next year in 1984, around May of 1984, I brought him into the business. And he was certainly a key part too.
Can I pause and ask why you think Paul, it didn't seem like you guys knew each other because the consultant put you guys in touch. Why do you think he chose you to come in straight out of school to come in?
Well, I think I presented well. I was clearly a pretty smart guy. The original deal, I was working for the consultant. The consultant paid my salary initially, and it wasn't a very high salary. And so the really low risk for Paul, but I think I became pretty successful as my own broker pretty quick. And then Paul and I chose to sever the relationship with the consultant and go in full time together.
Nice.
And then soon thereafter, I bought into the business. And the first technology I developed, I actually went to one of the first conferences I went to was in 1984. The TBCA preceded the TIA. And I went to that conference specifically looking for tech, and I found a tech platform that started to approach what I was thinking was valuable. It was made, a proprietary tech that was made for a broker in Medford, Oregon. I forget the name, but it was fairly large brokerage, one of the largest at the time in Medford. And I was able to buy their tech from the developer who owned the rights to it for like $25,000 with unlimited modifications. So then I went to town, and I don't think it ultimately was a very good deal for the developer, but that was kind of my first iteration of creating this software. What it was, and at that time I was, key salesperson, running operations for a while and building the technology. Mm-hmm. And my book of business was built on the metals industry. I was kind of the first broker to really build a book of business on the metals side, and Those clients are still big clients in the brokerage business in general. Metal trading firms, people like that.
How's it like back then calling a shipper and presenting yourself as a freight broker?
Hey there, amazing listeners. If you're enjoying what you're hearing in our podcast, we need your support. It will only take a moment, but it would mean the world to us. Please make sure to hit the like button on this video, subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to share with one of your friends that would enjoy our content. Your engagement helps us reach more people and bring more awesome episodes to you. Thanks a million, and thanks for being part of the podcast community.
Yeah, So first of all, the reason Paul threw me a yellow pages and told me to call sand companies is because the big win was on low value freight, where low value product, where the freight cost was a high percentage of the cost of the product. So if we could save them money on the freight costs, it was a big sell and hugely valuable to them. Secondly, low risk of damage, right? Little liability and easy to load, easy to unload. So palletized freight that was low value, that therefore the freight was a high component of the total cost, was an easy target.
How did claims work back then?
There was a lot of iterations around that. I think a lot of it was taking care of your client so you didn't lose the client.
Got it. It was like almost like an umbrella policy at the time.
Yeah, we early on secured what was I think, I'm not certain of this, but I think we may have secured and invented, don't quote me on that, the first contingent cargo policy. And I think Paul and I did that together with, I forgot who it was with, but it was a major insurance company. And I think we kind of created this concept of a contingent cargo policy, but don't quote me on that.
Sure.
But it was really early on. And so the cost of that was initially extremely low because the insurance company thought it'll never apply, right? The liability is on the carrier.
Sure.
And so this contingent cargo only applies if the carrier's insurance doesn't pay.
Got it.
Little did they know that, that risk kind of changes. But
Yeah.
the big risk, of course, is not the value of the cargo. The big risk is a truck hitting a school bus full of children. Right. And so that evolved over time. I think you asked me the question, what was it like calling on shippers?
Yeah.
I was able to be pretty successful, but it was a fairly easy sell. Let's face it, we had very little competition. Paul and I developed a rate matrix, state-to-state rate matrix on a per-mile rate, essentially, and we just quoted off of that. And I think we kind of said $1 a mile, right? Minimum of $3.50. We kind of said $1 a mile is what it was going to cost us, and we priced off of that. And a remarkable lot of stuff has not changed, right? It's a very free market industry that you charge whatever you can get away with, and you make whatever spread you can. Mm-hmm. And what I taught a lot of people early on is take the money when you can, because you're going to have to break even and lose money on others, right? So don't be afraid to make money just because you booked this you found the perfect truck and you booked it at a cheap rate. Don't be afraid to take your spread, and you don't have to give that back to the client, because you're going to need to take care of that client and not go back to him for more money. When you make a quote, your word should be good. If it's not, you lose credibility. Yeah. Now, of course, a lot of that changed. There's a lot of brokers even today, and even back then, they would, one of the first innovations we made was to price up front and commit on the freight. Before
That wasn't
we had
the
a
case
truck.
before?
Correct. And even now, certainly then, C.H. Robinson, which was one of the earliest brokers, then they grew out of the produce brokerage business. They would say, I'll see if I can find a truck. They would find a truck, then they would take the load and they would price it based on the knowledge of what the cost was going to be.
Afterwards.
Yeah. So they wouldn't commit on the freight. So our creating of a rate matrix, remember, it was a pretty old school industry at that point, which was a lot of old people who had this authority, which was hugely valuable. So there was no competition. They deadheaded back empty, because if they had authority from Illinois to Ohio, didn't mean they had authority from Ohio to Illinois. So they would typically deadhead back empty. And there was very little it was very little difficult to compete with that. They would charge enough to cover the round trip, and it just wasn't a very efficient industry, and there wasn't a lot of innovation. So a couple of young guys who were pretty smart, college educated, could really make some big inroads. So one of those was committing on knowing a price that we could quote up front, committing to it, having enough of an understanding about the market that we could find a try. And at the early days, I would say it wasn't having enough knowledge of the market of where we could find a truck. It was just dialing until we did. A commitment to execute and to earn every business, earn each client. And then in my worldview, you quote a rate, you own it. So if you quoted too low and you had to make 700 calls to cover this load to lose 10 cents a mile or even more, lesson learned, but you don't go back to the customer and say, I screwed up. Now, that's not the way a lot of businesses run now or then, but to me, that ability to quote and commit to the customer and deliver, even if the load bounces 3 times, right? The customer doesn't need to know. And even if you end up losing $1,000 on the load, the customer doesn't need to know. So that ability to build that relationship with the client, I think, was a real innovation in the industry at the time.
It was like, from what you said, it got lost, or more or less in today's day.
I don't know if that got lost. I know that was a big part of Jeff's marketing when he started Coyote, right? Is we'll take your freight and we'll get it covered. And Jeff had built he trained all his reps on the hot pot on the same day freight, and they a lot, one of the reasons he got funding is they were losing thousands of dollars on loads to execute that promise that he had guaranteed in his marketing. So I think, but I think what's happened is a little bit once VC funding came in and PE money came in, it became a little bit more challenging. In the end, Backhaulers was a cash cow. We made, I knew the numbers by the back of my hand financially. I knew every cost item. I knew exactly what our spread should be. And we held true to it, and it generated a tremendous amount of cash flow. And the people who joined the organization at a very young age, which was all college kids that we were hiring our friends, right? And that circle kind of started to grow. We're making a lot of money pretty quick.
How old were you at this point?
Well, I came out of college. So I was born in 1961. So in 83, I was 22 years old. And I left after 10 years, when I was 32.
Wow. So, when you came in, Paul brought you on, you partnered together, then Jeff came into the picture.
Yeah.
Who else was there? And how did it grow? Can you take us through those, initial years of the growth? What did it look like?
Yeah. So this gets into memory. So if there's people listening to this podcast that the reality, I heard on, I don't remember what it was on recently, but that history is really how you recall it, right?
Sure.
So, but I would say Jeff was, I don't know that he was the third employee, but I think Paul and I already started hiring other key people there. And Jeff came on, like I said, about a year after I did, maybe a year, a little more than a year, but probably about a year after I did. John Thompson, I don't know if you guys know of him. He started ATG Freight, which I think still exists on Clybourne, with Harold Gross. John Thompson probably came within a year after Jeff. And Paul and I really kind of invented a lot of the operational aspects of what we wanted to do. To start with, before we created technology, we developed a card where you put all of the information on the freight. And our load board was a metal rack. This is the kind of the way that people did it in the past. And we had 5 columns on the metal rack: ordered, booked, checked in, picked up, delivered. And we had this card with all the load information, and you could fill out all the information we needed for a load, and we moved the card across the board. Yeah. And very early on, Jeff was starting to play with a Commodore 64, and he developed a board that basically just moved X's across the board. But what we took when I looked for a computer system, it was really to replicate an order entry screen that had all of the information that you needed on the load that had been on this card, and then be able to have easy visualization of where the status of the loads are, so you could manage a large book of business. And then assigning it to carriers, and then eventually managing a carrier base capturing information on carriers, and then a big matching. Became a big matching technology that based on information, you could quickly identify what the right carrier for a load was. So I think we did that pretty early on. So
How was it, I guess once that technology, the digital technology started evolving, you started using computers to some extent. Was it difficult to hire people who knew how to actually program this software at the time?
yeah, well, like I said, the first iteration we built with a programmer. He revised an existing system. And I think the first, and I think we ran with that system probably till about 1990 when, and it was on the Unix operating system. No, it was on the PIC operating system, which was a competitor to Unix at the time. So on the PIC operating system is what our software worked on. And that was our software for the first 7-8 years. Jeff actually wanted to work in DOS and started to build the next iteration of the software, and certainly continued it after I left. And, there's a little bit story about relationships there, but possibly the best TMS system that was ever built and that Jeff built is Express, right? It was the system that Backhaulers started that C.H. Robinson eventually bought. Was that his first iteration or his second iteration? I don't recall, but it really took a lot of the operational processes that we developed and it created it in the state of the art. So some of the operational processes we developed is the split carrier model, right? And that kind of, interestingly enough, I think, and I may be wrong, grew out of my search for a phone system. We were looking for a new phone system, and I hired a phone consultant because we were starting to grow. There's probably 20, 30 people at the time. And I hired a phone consultant who suggested ACD groups and calls coming in and a user being able to press 1, 2, 3, or 4 based on what they were looking for. So he started to talk to me about what are the different functions in your organization and how can we divide the call volume based on those functions. And so it clearly became either carriers were calling or drivers were calling or customers were calling. So that, I think, was the first reason why we created carrier-focused reps and customer-focused reps.
Because of that phone.
I think the phone division of things was kind of the first iteration for that. And I mentioned John Thompson's name because he came in early and he became in charge of carrier side. And he was incredible. As a manager, he came out of managing a restaurant business. I think it was Fuddruckers. He was managing Fuddruckers. He was probably 24 years old managing the Fuddruckers on Skokie Valley Boulevard. And one of the, I would say Paul's the best salesperson I ever saw. He was just a natural. And as a business leader, he's amazing, right? There's nobody who's worked for Paul Lote that doesn't love the guy. And he has, so many people have exited Backhaulers and created their own businesses with his support over the years. And I would say John Thompson was one of the best managers I ever saw of people. And so he created this carrier where they had a lot of the responsibility for executing what it was that we did. And there was always, even at the early days, there was always a little conflict about who got what commission. We were commission. I was a commission rep. I got hired at $15,000 a year, and I was a commission rep early on. And then pretty soon I started making a lot of money because there was a lot of money to be made. And so then once we created the split model, it became the question of who got what portion of that commission. We knew early on. And so that became a little, my guess is it started out at 70-30. 70 to the customer and 30 to, and that conversation's been going on since, right? And a lot of the carrier side, people who do the split model make that a team thing, and whether it's individual, whether it's team. But John Thompson was brought in to took over the carrier side of the operation, and we obviously grew that team very, very strong.
So
sorry, if you ask a question, I'm probably going to rant.
No, I love this. It's great. I just want to hear you talk, Noam.
Yeah.
So I guess American Backhaulers grew. You said that it was financially, it was a cash cow.
Yeah.
Making a lot of money. And then in 1992, you decided to leave.
Yes.
Okay. What was there a reason for that?
Stupidity is probably the primary reason. I was 30 years old, making a lot of money, first job, essentially. I thought it was easy. A couple other factors. I had really gotten interested in environmental things and started to feel like, we could pay lip service to saying we were environmental because we were making the transportation system more efficient, but it was purely about making money. And I had been, very liberal, very into environmental things, felt that was an important thing, and wanted to do something that was more directly related to that. A lot of my customers early on were recycling metals businesses. So I was hauling UBC, used beverage cans, around the country when that was the best, most successful example of recycling. Maybe it still is. And I was hauling UBC that would then be made into aluminum for Alcan and for Alcoa and for lots of different companies. But so I started to get more and more interested in that and wanted to get involved. And then I would say the other thing is there started to be some stress between the leaders in the organization. I was operationally in charge and running everything, and I would say Jeff was brilliant and wanted to start to work on the technology, and I wasn't giving him the space to do that. And I think there became some tension, and so there started to become some conflict in the office. And for me, as a 30-year-old, it was like, if there's conflict, I'll just take my ball and I'll go home. So, but at the end of the day, it was obviously an enormous mistake. I had a buy-sell agreement with Paul. I sold back to him and left the organization. 7 years later, they sold to C.H. Robinson for a lot of money.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about the business that you started, the Greener Cleaner?
Yeah, so obviously when I sold the business, there was a non-compete associated with it. I was interested in environmental technology. I was interested in getting involved in environmental business. I joined an organization called Social Venture Network, which grew out of, what's it called? I can't believe I don't remember it. But there was had started to become an organization of environmental businesses like Stonyfield Farms, like Ben & Jerry's. All these people became part of this network of organizations that collaborated. It sounds like it was an amazing fun. I wasn't part of that, but out of that grew an investment arm because people were looking for deals all the time to invest in sustainable businesses. So I joined that organization, and particularly looking for a sustainable business that I could get involved in, bringing my money and my business expertise to help grow. That didn't end up, I invested in a couple deals, but that didn't end up being where I found it. The Greener Cleaner, I came across an organization called the Center for Neighborhood Technology that did innovative stuff in sustainability. And they were wanting to bring to market a very new technology called professional wet cleaning, which was an environmental alternative to dry cleaning. Dry cleaning was a very toxic business. Fluorinated solvents in urban neighborhoods. It was a big problem. And there was this new technology that had been developed in Germany, and there was one store in New York that was sort of doing it. So I partnered with them as a public-private partnership to bring my capital and my business expertise and their technology expertise to start a business in Chicago, and became a national demonstration site so cleaners from around the country could come and look at our work. So they brought these guys in from New York to train. I was going to be kind of just the owner. I'll do my business expertise, but I wasn't going to be an operator. And I hired a plant manager with the help of Center for Neighborhood Technology. Ann was her name. She had been from the industry, and a great woman. And the New York people came in to train us on this new technology. And when they left, Ann and I looked at each other and we just said, we're screwed. Because there really wasn't a technology, but then we had to figure it out. And so we worked with the people who invented the technology. Mila was the first person who developed wet cleaning equipment and wet cleaning chemicals. And we really began to refine the process and figure it out. And the Greener Cleaner, but at the end of the day, I invested in it because it was a sustainable business. But at the end of the day, the business is the business. And the business was dry cleaning, and it's a tough business.
For 16 years?
I started in 95, so in a sustainable business in 95 was pretty early. Mm-hmm. There were challenges because anybody could say they were green, even if they were recycling their fluorinated, their hangers, they could say they were green.
Okay.
So there's a certification issue. And at the end of the day, people believed in stuff, but they really weren't willing to spend any more money. And that started the trend to people not dry cleaning as much because they were dressing more casual. So it was a tough business. I made a deal with Dominic's. We were in 6 Dominic stores. I had about 3 other stores. But it was a tough business. So it was just an interesting, at the end of the day, even if it was sustainable, the business is the business, and I couldn't pay my employees that well, and there wasn't that much business to generate. And at the end of the day, and and my plant manager actually, after a year, she became a celebrity around the country in the dry cleaning industry, and so she ended up going out and going on speaking tours. And so I ended up in 98 kind of going full-time into the business, maybe 97, and started doing everything. Same way I learned the trucking business. We were the dispatchers, we were finding the trucks, we were selling the freight. So I was cleaning, and I was driving a van, and I was pressing, and a little bit of everything. But we eventually had 15, 20 people. So it was tough business. In 2005, I had to put my kids through college. I realized cleaner wasn't going to quite cover that, so I went back to the business that I knew would make money, which was the freight business.
Nice. I'm kind of curious, Noam, because like I know like all of us like go through life and we pick up some wisdom along the way, and then maybe we look back and like maybe we shouldn't have done this or we should have done this. I'm kind of curious, like when you left American Backhaulers and then did Greener Cleaner, what kind of thoughts were going through your mind afterwards? Like, would you like to tell us, like us younger kids now, like how should we like potentially
in hindsight?
Yeah.
Is there an advice that you'd give? Being
The takeaways from that.
Well,
situations like that.
I think a couple things that I figured out eventually, and that is I didn't fully recognize how extraordinary the opportunity that I was. You know, I've been given some great opportunities in my life multiple times. And to be the first employee at American Backhaulers and to be building, you know, as entrepreneurs, basically Paul and I would say, hey, let's do this. And we would do it. If it worked, we would do it more. If it didn't, we would do something else. And so that was really the energy with which Backhaulers was going on. And I think the whole team, as different people came in, they got more involved. But Paul and I, in the initial designs of it, operationally, the structure that we worked, I was definitely a major part of the early technologies and the innovation. So the ability to have an idea and do it was extraordinary. And how unique that opportunity and how unique that business was, this new business industry, I didn't recognize. So
why don't you think you recognize it? Did you ever think about like what about it, that opportunity?
You know, I just think I was young when I came in and I was running the thing. I never really had any mentoring for management. And I think that hurt me probably. And the nature of my personality probably was just like, I'll just do it again. I would say it took me a couple years. During the process before I opened the Greener Cleaner, I went to U of C and got my MBA. So I did that for a couple years through the executive program. And I would say, you know, once I made the decision, I didn't want to look back. So I kept looking straight forward and trying to make it successful. I would say eventually I started to recognize the significance of my decision. But
Yeah. And then, so you go to Echo to run the truckload or build the truckload division.
Yeah, so that's an interesting story. So in 2005, I needed to put my kids through college, knew I needed to go somewhere where I knew how to make money, which was the freight business. And I reconnected. So one thing I didn't tell you was when I left Backhaulers, we hired a guy by the name of Harold Gross, who Jeff and I had gone to camp with together in Wisconsin growing up. And Harold had been an attorney, and then he had started an ice cream company called Kid Millions. And Harold came in, and basically I trained him and gave him my book of business. So that was Harold's start. So Harold, when Backhaulers sold, a couple years after, like a lot of people split off and formed their own, Harold and Johnny started ATG. So that's probably 2001, right? American Transport Group. And actually through a friend of mine that was outside of the business that had been friends with Harold, I got reconnected with them, and then through Harold's kindness, they brought me back into the industry. They were about 100 people at the time, and it's 2005, so I'm 44 years old, and there's a bunch of 20-year-olds there.
And what changed?
Am I 44 years old or am I 35 years old? 69. Yeah, 44 years old.
Freight agents, wouldn't it be life-changing to have a higher commission split and a support team focused on helping you build your dream? At TAB, we pay our agents up to 80% of gross profit without compromising on technology or support. Make more money and guarantee a better experience for your customers and carriers by joining the team at TAB. It all starts with a short, enjoyable phone call with our leadership team to see the TAB difference. To learn more and schedule a quick call, go to tab-llc.com and change your future.
So when you came back in, what was the biggest change that you noticed?
It still amazes me that not a lot. From the operational approach that backhaulers took for the Chicago model and the economics of the industry, not a lot has changed. Two things have changed. Certainly technology's gotten a lot better, but Freight Friend, which I built, it has a couple elements to it, but one of them is building the infrastructure I built in my original product that's followed through with Express and with Bazooka and with everything else about the big matching game and managing carriers, and that carriers matter, and getting to know them is the job that a broker should do. So that technology, what it does, hasn't really changed a lot. What a broker does hasn't really changed a lot. I would think some things that have changed is that, public load boards came out, and broker reps have gotten used to just posting loads on the public load board and sitting on their phones and taking inbound calls and watching the NCAA tournament. So reps have lost the art of talking to carriers and lost the value of that carrier relationship. This is something I've been preaching for 40 years, that really, really matters. The other thing that changed, that Jeff changed, was bringing VC money into the industry. And so focused on growth. Another big innovation besides technology that Jeff made to American Backhaulers was this hiring 30 people a month or every 3 months as a training program and creating a really tight training program to just drive growth. Jeff brought that in, developed that early training program, and really started to drive growth at Backhaulers, and then eventually took over all the technology there after I left. And I think that was a real innovation. So that, I think, changed. And then Jeff's innovation with Coyote was bringing VC money in, basically buying growth. Coyote was losing a fortune for a long time. So an industry that used to make 6% of gross revenue and a 33% of net revenue, right, was suddenly losing lots of money. So that was a huge change in the industry, that suddenly outside capital came in that was just spending money for growth. And Coyote grew a lot by underpricing all the bids. And it was very frustrating, I think, for existing businesses who were trying to run traditionally to compete with that, because the prices that they were quoting made no sense. But so I think that was another thing that changed a lot. But operationally, I don't think a lot has changed. I think the concept of building carrier relationships has been lost, and I think the market is starting to swing more and more rapidly.
Do you think the volatility is because of the loss of those?
Well, I think we have a crisis of commitment in the industry and a crisis of relationships. That it's who's going to screw over who. Like, we have contracts, right? People take on contracts, but there's no, right? If you blow off the contract, nothing happens.
Actually, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I think that's just a general, in my opinion, there's a general broader theme just in general about our society that I see it. And which is funny that you mentioned that for freight, but my
yeah, but when you write a contract for a shipper that you're going to take all these loads and you're going to take 98%, there's really no penalty, And carriers do the same thing. They just, so at this point, the industry's become who's going to screw over who first. And the market shifts so fast, and carriers and brokers can be saddled with a contract based on prior pricing in a low market, and suddenly the market shifts fast. What do? Are they going to lose money continuously for however long the market's going to stay to move that freight if their carriers walk away from it, or are they going to walk away from it? And shippers, when the market that had been high dropped suddenly, and they had gone out for bid when only on an annual basis, well, they'll just do another bid, and they'll blow off their committed carriers. So that lends itself to, and then with technology, pricing and information, it moves so fast and is so visible to everybody that everything can change on a dime. And the problem with the trucking industry, though, the reason it becomes more challenging is because still it's a heavy capital investment industry. So it's not like an Uber business that you can add capacity just by getting a bunch more drivers to drive their own car.
Or a bunch of ads, for drivers.
It's at least 6 months in advance decision to order and get actual trucks online, and then for drivers to get trained and come into the market. And so often there's a huge time lag in the decision to invest in more capacity, that by the time it comes online, the market has shifted, demand has started to drop, capacity isn't increased, and we get these big shifts. So now we're in a market that is staying remarkably low, even though demand is pretty fine, and carriers are exiting the market, but not at a pace fast enough, given the influx that came into the market during the good times after COVID. It's not going fast enough to reduce capacity enough to level that playing, So I think, I don't know, what's the average rate per mile that carriers are getting? The reality is it is well below their cost. Certainly their cost at which they bought equipment, 2-3 years ago.
Maybe some of them are staying alive because they thought perhaps that heyday wasn't going to last forever. And when they made money, they maybe stored some away from it.
Yeah, I would say for the owner-operators and the young people, the new people that came into the industry, it's unlikely that they stored away the money, but they're probably not tabulating their replacement cost of their equipment, right? And when they have to replace their equipment, they'll shut their doors.
Yeah.
Will the market come back soon? I think it's, there's indications that it has leveled off, but demand has actually been fine. It is the capacity relative to the demand that we're still in a glut. So I think the question was what has changed. It amazes me how little has changed operationally in the business, yet how many brokers, at the end of the day, what is a broker in any industry? It's something where there's a lot of providers that a middleman can come in and do a valuable job for buyers because they can understand all the providers and all the different sources to choose from, figure out what's best, and distribute it in a more effective manner. But that, by definition, requires brokers to get to know carriers, build relationships, and deliver the best solution for their people. Well, if they're just posting their freight on public load boards and taking inbound calls, is that a real value? But there's a lot of brokers that's what they do, right? And they just hire a lot of reps to dial for dollars. Maybe they're doing cradle to grave, maybe they're doing split. So to me, the industry had for a while ago kind of devolved. You asked the question early on, why did I leave Backhaulers? One of the conflicts that Paul and I had was about commitment to delivering service. For me, my word was a lot, and I focused on the freight that I had, and I would work my tail off, or I would expect eventually the carrier department to work their tail off to cover the freight that we had commitments on. But at some point, you get a shitty load, it can suck your carrier department. You get a shitty load that's underpriced, it can suck your carrier department dry. And so Paul basically eventually said, if we lose a customer, there's tons more we can get. And I think we had a disagreement there. At the end of the day, he was probably right in terms of a growth business, but for me, it was really, my word was very, very important, overly so. So I was on my soapbox. But I think that, to me, at the end of the day, brokers, what is it that we are actually doing that's creating value for our clients? And people really need to think about that. And carrier relationships and knowledge of the industry and knowledge of the market is a huge part of that.
Yeah.
For a while, brokers grew exclusively by shippers' desire to create an arm's length transaction with the carriers. They wanted a broker in the middle because they knew that when they started getting sued by shippers, when accidents started happening, and shippers started getting sued because a carrier had an accident, and the carrier didn't have enough insurance to cover the huges of the claim, and they'd go after the shippers. These shippers wanted to create an arm's length transaction from somebody who had a deep pocket. So that drove a ton of shippers to go to brokerage just for the liability reason. Since then, that veil of liability, that veil of protection through brokers has even evolved. So I think that's become less of the case.
I'm curious, no, just when you were at American Backhaulers, you didn't use any load board? There was like nothing that accessible?
DAT was the Iowa truck.
Yeah.
So when we came out, DAT did exist as TV screens and truck stops. One of the ways we would source new carriers, and I did it, and I trained people to do it, and that was part of my initial training programs. You'd go stand on a bridge over a highway, and you'd write trucks names down and what city they were in, and then you'd call them, or you'd go to a truck stop and you'd look at all the trucks, right? So drivers would see the TV screen with available loads. That was early DAT. But eventually, as technology came on board, the DAT became a technology load board. Then eventually, I think in the early 90s, Internet Truckstop came into being. And we early on limited access to public load boards to only certain, even when they came out, to only certain managers.
Yeah.
But it was earlier, so, I don't know exactly how they managed it from after I left in 92, but I think the only way to really train your reps to do things the right way is to take that crutch away or to limit its uses to certain managers who come in at a certain time.
Yeah.
How do you describe a well-crafted training process or guidelines versus one that's not?
Real quick before you answer that, no, I did want to mention that. So I worked at Truck Freight. I was friends with Danny back at U of I.
Danny Zamos?
Danny Bazelon. And that's Gary Bazelon's son.
Oh.
I was friends with him at U of I. That's how I got my job at Truck. And what you just described there was really similar to my training. The training program at Truck was phenomenal. And part of training class was actually driving to just truck stops and writing down MCs. We'd write down all the MCs we could, like with our training manager, Steve Schneider. We would go to a truck stop, write down all the MCs, and then we would come back to the office, and then we would, carrier phone one existed, so we'd pull it up. It was 2015.
And call those carriers.
Call all carriers, and then we'd build relationships with them. And then the TMS that Gary and his team built was very similar to what you mentioned earlier, where it was like, I think it was like loads that are still not fully confirmed, but then like confirmed loads that are booked, loads that are dispatched, and then like it had the same process that you described. Yeah, the board, and just like it brought back a lot.
And I assume it had some matching technology around it too. Were you gathering information on carriers and able to enter into the system?
I could do an OD search, like origin destination search, from like the system, and they had data for like already like 10 or 15 years compiled. Load history. So that's the first thing you do. Like we didn't have access to load boards either. Like for the first year, I had never posted a load on DAT. It was only the managers. But it was really good because we'd only post the loads that weren't moved. Like we had 24 hours to cover and they weren't covered yet. That's when they would get posted.
So all the spin-offs from Backhaulers, which is is Arrive and Coyote and Command and Echo was not a spin-off from Backhaulers, but they followed this approach, which really was the carrier matters. At the end of the day, is the carrier is all we have. Let's get to know them, figure them out, and not focusing on load boards. You asked about a training program. I totally have to credit Jeff for and I would say that operational process that I'm describing, I was instrumental in developing with Paul, but execution-wise, I was figuring out how to incorporate technology. Phone system was part of it, all sorts of elements. But the training program and the strategy to hire 30 reps at a time to drive growth because he had studied call centers, right? It was all Jeff. And Jeff really developed the earliest training programs. And I think a lot of the training programs that have come out of there still follow that. Some of the things that were fairly obvious is you take a blank map of the country and you have to write down what all the states are. You have to get to know a map of the country, start to get an understanding of good lanes and bad lanes by regions, right? Back hauls and head hauls. And early on, I taught economics of transportation, which was always, I was an economics major. And in fact, the first course I took when I got into transportation was a Wharton course in the graduate program called Economics of Transportation. But the economics of transportation are interesting in that it's not just supply and demand, it's supply and demand from origin and the supply and demand from the destination and how those two things interact. And that's going to determine price on a load, right? And supply and demand is incredibly real time. Supply and demand on a Friday is different than a Monday to Thursday, let alone that the market's shifting and it's cyclical and it's produce season. So there's a lot of, but that origin and destination combination of supply and demand always made the economics of transportation. So I tried to teach that economic, but I think, you'd start with a map. Often operationally, the first place a new rep would go would be hot pot, would be dispatch. They'd start out by dispatching drivers where they'd have to learn every aspect of the load, and they'd learn all the crap. They'd learn about everything that went wrong, right? I got here and there's no load. They don't know what I'm talking about, or the forklift broke, or they're going to make me wait 3 hours, or the drive, the dispatch, you get embedded with all the things that can go wrong. And at the end of the day, a broker, part of what they need to do is resolve problems, and it's crisis management, because there's so many elements, right? Driving a truck across the country and all the things that are still involved in that hasn't changed, right? Until we learn to move goods over the internet, this business is not going to really change in the operation. And the driver and his truck, that's who's in charge. That's who matters. So I think I'm evolving the whole.
This has been amazing, Noam. I feel like we should honestly record for 3 more hours. We only have 10 minutes left. So 10, 15 minutes. Yeah. I did want to touch up on optimal freight.
I'll talk a little bit about Echo briefly.
Sure.
And then I'll go to optimal freight, right? So I had the idea of Freight Friend. So I worked for Harold and Johnny from 2005 to 2007, probably. And then left primarily because I was still saddled with trying to deal with a greener cleaner, and I was having to leave the office, and Harold was getting pissed at me, and I was like, I'm a 45-year-old guy that's getting, yelled at a little bit. I just kind of said, to hell with this. And but I started, and then I decided to open my own brokerage, and I got licensed for Optimal I got a license for Optimal Freight, but started to have the idea of taking a load board, public load board, and believing that relationships matter, layering a friendship element on top of it, like LinkedIn or Facebook. So this was back in 2008, 7, 8. I had this idea of this load board, and I started looking up names for what this would be, and I thought of, how about My Freight? So I went onto wherever you search for, domain names, and I looked up My Freight, and somebody had it, and it was this company called Echo Global Logistics, which was a broker. I was like, who's a broker in Chicago that I don't know? And the name on it was Doug Wagner. So I pick up the phone and I call Doug. And I have already gotten licensed for Optimal Freight. Doug and I start talking. I tell him my background. They had multiple fits and starts trying to start to do truckload. And that's one of the reasons they tried to be a truckload broker, couldn't, and had this LTL idea. So instead of, I had already gotten licensed for Optimal Freight, I'd already actually secured office space. Instead, I went to work for Echo Global Logistics. Eric Lefkowski and Brad Keywell hired me, and I, through some, eventually started the entire truckload department. Groupon actually started in our section of the office, that they were taking some of our seats. There's about 150 people, and soon after I left, or right around the time I left, truckload was about half of their business at the time, and then eventually they bought Command and went into truckload. That's kind of how I got involved in Echo, and really instilled Truckload 101 into a process that the sales and the payment and everything was built around an LTL model, and I had to claw and fight to get them to eventually let me guide them to change all the processes from operationally to payment to everything, and kind of involved a lot of the technology development too, in a challenging system. So in 2011, that was kind of the first pure job I had. Because at American Backhaulers, it really wasn't a job. And I went and started Optimal Freight in 2011.
Okay.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about Optimal?
Well, Optimal was a small brokerage that I started on my own. At that point, I had developed FreightFriend. I had hired a developer to build it on the side by concept of FreightFriend, which was initially just layering this friendship element so that one side had to invite the other and the other side had to accept on top of a public load board. And then even a little bit at Echo, I started developing the elements of the technology that we had built at Backhaulers, which is part of all the proprietary systems since, which allowed you to manage carriers and all the matching. I had started to incorporate that into it. Once I opened Optimal Freight, I needed technology to kind of do that. I did not feel that the TMS needed to be proprietary anymore. I felt once CH sold, that cat was out of the bag. So I was looking for technology of a TMS, came across MercuryGate, had this thing called FreightFriend. Monica Wooden at the time, I started Optimal Freight. I took on MercuryGate technology, helped them develop their truckload capabilities, and we became partners for her to market FreightFriend. So that was the initial iteration of FreightFriend, was in 2011 when I started Optimal Freight. Built a brokerage for a while, eventually took control of FreightFriend afterwards. When I sold Optimal Freight in 2018, I went into full-time into FreightFriend. But it had been a functioning side project for me that Schneider ran their whole brokerage operation on FreightFriend, the guys who covered the freight, for about 3 or 4 years till they eventually started to build their own proprietary technology again.
So that's awesome. So we got, now we're at FreightFriend. FreightFriend started 2018.
2015 on LinkedIn it was posted.
You went full.
On LinkedIn, FreightFriend was showing that you started 2015 FreightFriend, and then recently you got acquired by Truckstop.
Yeah, so I'm one of our Schneider I mentioned, right? So there was somewhere between 3 and 6 months, and we disagree on this, that a guy by the name of Ben Schukart chose to leave Schneider, primarily because he didn't get a promotion that he should have gotten. And he was like, okay, I'll leave. He came to work for me at Echo. Brilliant guy. We learned a ton from each other, built a very, very strong relationship. Very soon thereafter, Schneider realized the mistake they made, and Ben bleeds orange, and he ended up going back to them, but that relationship stayed put. And then he became a huge client of FreightFriend because it did what they needed it to do. So I want to mention Ben, who I think is, Ben and the whole team at Schneider are some of the smartest guys in the industry operationally and technology-wise, and built an amazing brokerage. So FreightFriend was a side project. In 2018, I went to it. I sold Optimal Freight to TFI, Transforce, which was kind of starting to try to be a roll-up in transportation, both asset trucking, Canadian business, and brokerage. So really Transport America, which had been acquired by TFI. I had a relationship with them through somebody that used to work at Echo. The people that had used to work at Echo were starting to go far and wide, and he brought me into the conversations with Transport America. They acquired Optimal Freight. I stayed on for 1.5 years while maintaining about 25% ownership, and then ended up, when that ran up, I went full-time into FreightFriend.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit like the growth of FreightFriend and like the acquisition?
Yeah, so FreightFriend was originally built on a .NET platform by one outside developer. When I went into it full-time, I went to 1871 in the merchandise market, specifically looking for developers. One of the reasons Schneider left FreightFriend and wanted to build their own is because I wasn't advancing the technology, because it was a side project. I was still building a brokerage. So I went in and found developers piece by piece. 1871 was on the 12th floor of the merchandise mart. P44 was on the 13th. So I initially met some developers from P44 who had left P44, Melvin and Mark Ramos, and through them met other people, and was lucky enough to find a guy by the name of Dimitrios, who lived at Greece.
Okay.
And he brought a guy by the name of Rumen, who lived in Bulgaria, that they had worked together. And then Ross Litzenberg, who came out of Update. He was a front-end developer. Dimi became the lead pretty quickly as an engineer designing, and we built. And then eventually KD came out of where Ryan Schreiber was.
At Metaphor?
No, yeah, the technology company. It was an early.
The startup, digital freight brokerage startup, or no?
Yes.
I forgot what.
He said it. He said it.
Yeah, I brought a data science person from that organization that Ryan actually introduced me to. And then Pau from Spain was our UX UI designer, some other people in the mix, but built an incredible team, sheer out of luck, around the world, who built really a remarkable state-of-the-art technology for FreightFriend on mostly a Google shop. On the Go was the back-end language we used, React on the front end, Postgres database, a remarkable technology, and scaled it to some degree, but ran into a shift in the market, never really funded. And so once the market shifted on us, we needed to find a strategy, an exit strategy. And I met the Truckstop guys. I met Sean Dehan at TIA in last year's TIA. We started conversation in April, and I think his interest was for the public load board to get involved earlier in the freight cycle with brokers when it was still private freight based on this relationships, incorporate Truckstop's data into FreightFriend's intelligence, and deliver it through Truckstop's delivery system to engage carriers was a great strategy. I think he valued my expertise, he valued the team, and he valued the technology. Truckstop had now been really a combination of technologies that they had acquired, some of it fairly old, and FreightFriend was state-of-the-art technology. So I think the potential of that marriage is enormous, and we are working on trying to create the realization of that.
How far do you think you are away from
How far do I think we are from
the realization of?
We're engaged in building it as we speak. Okay. We've got very good ideas of what we're doing, and the vision really, like I said, is incorporating all the data that Truckstop has on carriers into our data science and our algorithms and our intelligence, so to make it much more. And then FreightFriend was delivering matching freight to carriers through their own carrier accounts and also through a userless environment. And with the risks of fraud now we can deliver matching freight to carriers through the Truckstop load board, but segregating the right loads to the right carriers within that environment. And in the Truckstop load board, we can do two things. We can validate users, validate carriers, that they're actual. Truckstop's always been way better at protecting from fraud than the DAT. They've always made carriers go through a lot more hoops. And then we can drive engagement at this load board through lots of mechanisms because it's a larger organization. So
you help the load boards do matching for the carriers, do matching with freight based on the relationships that they've connected with?
Well, FreightFriend's concept originally was layer of friendship on element of a public load. Public load board is public to everybody.
Right.
So the beauty of a public load board is it's this big matching game that's matching available trucks with available freight. The negative about a public load board, there's no relationship. So what kind of carriers are really going there? It's, maybe it's last minute for quality carriers. Otherwise, it's carriers that are living from spot load to spot load, or owner operators. So it really didn't foster relationships. It didn't really foster commitments. But I've been teaching relationships for 40 years. So now we layered a friendship element on top of it. But the beauty of it was this centralized matching board. So now we layer a friendship element on top of it. So one side invites the other to be a friend, the other side accepts. Only then are they seeing each other's freight and they're seeing each other's loads, and it's matching to each other.
And then it basically becomes a private,
centralized one place a carrier can go where all of their connected brokers or even shippers
are posting
freight, and that freight is only getting shared to the brokers that they're on board with and not one else. So that was the original concept back in 2008 of FreightFriend that I had. Mm-hmm. So now think of that. So in what we're delivering at Truckstop is a carrier who logs into Truckstop, now validated. The user is validated. The carrier is validated. Now he sees a blend of public and private loads, and the private loads he sees are only from the connected brokers he's supposed to be seeing. FreightFriend's technology manages all of that. And the matching is all driven by FreightFriend's algorithms, what loads they see where and how we rank them and how we score them. And we still now can drive engagement through their mobile app. There's a ton of carriers that are going to it. So that's part of the strategy as to what we're delivering to drive the engagement on the carrier side to the Freight Match load board, and give all the technology that FreightFriend has for building and managing carrier relationships in the FreightFriend UI.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Love that. No, so you've been in this industry for, I don't know, plus 40 years.
Yes.
Where do you see the next 40 years headed towards the industry? Like a lot of talk is like on AI, automation. What's your take?
I think that this crisis of commitment, this who's going to screw over who first, whether it's the carrier or the broker or the shipper, is not conducive to an efficient transportation system. At the end of the day, brokerage pitches that we help the efficiency of the market. We don't really. We kind of can create mayhem. And I think where the industry has to go soon is much more partnership between, and brokers certainly play a role in that if they're doing their job the right way, but it's partnership between carriers and broker shippers to mitigate the swings if the market shifts and start to maintain longer term contracts that you can count on freight and you count on the prices that you were quoted and you can count on the commitment so people can actually grow a sustainable business on both sides. That sustainability is always a challenge in a capitalist economy where quarterly profits dictate everything. And I certainly see that in working with Truckstop too, as it makes, we're a PE-owned company, it makes staying the course on decisions that we make challenging. But I think that has to change because otherwise we're going to have more, crises like we did during COVID where, 100 ships are getting stuck outside of a port and we can't get any trucks to pick them up.
And we can't scale.
So I think I don't know where it's going to go. I think driverless trucks are not as important because even with driverless trucks, you got the same reality about economics and infrastructure. We're not going to move goods over the internet in the foreseeable future, if ever, until we get to Star Trek. And
My sense
that's
has
what
changed.
really needs to change for us to be able to develop an efficient industry that is sustainable for all parties.
Yeah, my stance on driverless trucks has changed. Hasn't changed actually that much since we originally met, but the whole concept of every lane, every truck, every pallet that it's going to get moved without a driver anytime soon is I don't know.
Yeah,
what the timeline.
I think it'll be on specific line haul movements, trains of trucks. It's very similar to intermodal for driverless lanes and specific corridors, but the local delivery is going to be for the foreseeable future, and it's going to be with drivers. And that is a question about labor, where we're going to go, but I don't think that changes the economic challenges that I'm talking about.
Yeah, but those are two separate things.
Yeah.
Noam, I wish we had 3 more hours with you. I know we have to end it. Is there anything that you'd like to close off with?
No, I think what I said at the end there about where the industry needs to go and change and where I hope it finds a way to do it. Because sustainability, I'll go back to the sustainability question. Environmental sustainability, economic sustainability, they all kind of go together and we're all on this earth together. And we need to figure out a way that we can all feed our families and income stratification does not lend itself to long-term success. And so we need to find a way to create a sustainable industry between us. So,
Noam Frankel, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in to the Daily Freight Caviar podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, or if you didn't, leave a review. Let me know what you think. I appreciate any feedback. If you'd like to have more Freight Caviar content, go to freightcaviar.com and subscribe to my email newsletter.